For fellow art rebels who want to imagine new worlds, Revolution Art Society is a monthly newsletter and podcast that dives deep into the ideas, experiences, and people inhabiting the cracks in the establishment. Join artist and mother Maya Macrandalo as she explores enticing new ways of looking at the world and engages in conversations with creators of all kinds. Welcome once again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. The last few weeks have been intense for me. Ever since the eclipse in April, a lot of change has been happening, what feels like disruption. Now that will hopefully lead to growth in the future. It's taken a toll on my well-being, and so to be as kind to myself as possible, I delayed my podcast and newsletter. My partner was out of town for several weeks taking care of his father through some cancer treatments, and towards the end of that time, I ended up in the ER with pains in my chest. I was reminded of a pretty much identical experience I had shortly after I finished grad school during another period of uncertainty and change. I'm trying to figure out what it means to listen to and take care of my body, which is extra challenging when I have to balance that with taking care of another little human who is still very much dependent on me for survival. The larger challenge I'm facing right now is feeling a little lost. I'm trying to figure out how to navigate the world as it is, a world filled with violence, injustice, while also preparing for and moving towards a better future. But ultimately, a future that is beyond me. A future that my son will inhabit, will understand in a way that I will not. I am grappling with what my responsibilities are, what my priorities should be. I'm also trying to tease out different ways of looking at the world, looking at life, that move beyond the more materialist views that I have operated from for a long time. Anyway, I have a new essay that will hopefully be published by the time this podcast is out that starts to explore some of these ideas, or at least steps into an expanded space of looking at art, of being an artist, of being a human being. The title of the essay is Learning to Look at Art with My Baby, and it uses a few experiences that I had over the first year plus of my son's life, where we looked at art together, and using those experiences to explore some other larger questions about what art is and how the contemporary art discourse closes off some possibilities that I'd like to open up. So I hope you'll give it a read. I love writing essays, but an inevitable part of the process is that you can't put everything into an essay. It can't go on forever. It can't meander. It has to provide a very tight through line for the reader to follow, which means it's kind of a fiction in a way, since life isn't a tight narrative. So the essay tracks how my thinking about art evolved through my experience of looking at art with my baby, really focusing down on kind of 3, maybe you count 4 experiences. But really, that is only one thread in a tapestry of experiences over the past year that have affected how I think about art and life. And all of those things intermingle and intertwine. So the essay teases some of that out. But I kind of wanted to pick up a couple other threads. And so I thought, why not use two of my recent pieces in the Nurture Revolution series to explore some of these concepts further? The idea for these two collages that became the designs for the t-shirts and the bags and the books and all those different things, it started in the early days of the first trimester, which is the first few months after giving birth. We call it the fourth trimester. Obviously there are 3 trimesters of pregnancy, but since, babies actually are born early developmentally compared to other mammals, human babies, we now think of those first few months as another trimester, another important part of their development. And also your development as a mother. I told someone over email when he asked how I was doing that the only thing I could compare that time to was being in a war. And that might sound a little overwrought, but to be perfectly honest, that was the level of stress that my body was experiencing. I was experiencing a constant feeling that every moment was a life and death situation. Even if from an outside view, that wasn't what was occurring, that's what was occurring in my body every day, morning, noon, and night. It was a combination of sleep deprivation, anxiety, and massive hormonal changes that were happening simultaneously in my body, while also, having this incredibly profound, new, deeply transformative experience of taking care of a newborn. It was also the product of the ego dissolution of breastfeeding, of my body being the only thing keeping another body alive 24/7. And honestly, it's indescribable. I'm trying to describe it, but if you listen to the previous podcast, I had to listen to it as I was editing it. And you could just really hear how both Enid and I struggle to find the words to express, and so we would kind of sink into a word and just let it sit there. I think about that. I think it's a structuralist a method where they would write the word and then draw a line through the word to kind of denote that they were talking about the thing that the word is referencing, but that the word can never truly describe. And so I think about all the words that we were putting forward that really had lines through them in that conversation. So anyway, during this time, this image kept coming to me in my mind, as I'm sitting, I'm thinking about art, because I guess that's just what I do. And I saw, I have these stretcher bars in my studio, and they're even bigger than the mother portal piece that I've been kind of posting about. Again, somebody in the studio building was throwing out these stretcher bars, and I just took them. And I imagined those stretcher bars becoming this portrait of the Madonna. It's a nursing Madonna. It's a motif in Western art history, sometimes called Madonna Lactans, except that the entire face of the Madonna, which would also be my face, since it's a self-portrait, it's about my experience, would be obliterated by this explosion. So somewhere in this explosion, you might see like some eyes, a mouth, but just completely obliterated by color, flowers, beads, fabric, like this cloud where a face would be. It was a way to get at the feeling of obliteration that I felt at the end of each day, which wasn't really an ending at all. It was just a transition into nighttime where I would be up for hours nursing. This idea ended up becoming the Kali Lactans collage, which I then used in a number of the designs. However, that collage is actually quite different from what I initially imagined it would be. I didn't get around to shooting any reference photos until my son was 16 months old. So I was well past the newborn phase of nursing. I was in the toddler phase, really, which is a very different phase. And when I went to work with the images that we had shot, I couldn't ignore that we were both kind of laughing. The experience of taking the photos was really playful. My son thought it was hilarious that we were both naked. So he was like poking at me and just playing around. And so I had to honor that part of the experience as well. I still think that I want to make something more along the lines of that original vision that I had. Like, I still see it, I still want to create it. But this work, it's about the challenges of that postpartum time, but it's about more than that. So actually, before I made the Kali Lactans collage, I did the Kali Odalisque collage. And just a little bit of background, I started this practice of inhabiting and remixing motifs from Western art history with my How to Be a Monster series. In that work, I was playing around with the projections of the dominant culture on marginalized bodies, how we are seen as inherently threatening. It was a reaction to reading Darren Wilson's testimony in the shooting of Michael Brown, where he said that Brown looked like a demon. I connected this to a book called Much Maligned Monsters that traced how Europeans projected their demonic visions onto Eastern art, that the act of seeing itself is colored by our own imaginations, fears, and cultural contexts, that really objectivity itself isn't an illusion. I continued this work with my Antibody series, which further interrogated classical art and its relationship to white supremacy. I find inhabiting these motifs really generative because it's a way to trouble a lot of deep cultural assumptions in the present that have roots in the past. The Odalisque is a product of 18th century imaginations of the East as a site for European men to project their sexual fantasies. Interestingly enough, I was at the Getty this weekend, and they have this painting on loan from LACMA titled Plague in an Ancient City. I was joking with my partner that the painting should actually be called Plague, but make it sexy. The piece was painted during the mid-1600s, so during the Northern Renaissance. You can see the painter was really working with a lot of Renaissance themes, single point perspective, classical architecture, but what was really striking is these two topless female figures laying in the foreground. The painting is quite dark. The top left quarter, like literally 25% of it, is totally lost in shadow. But the figures in this foreground seem to have this spotlight shining on them. I couldn't help but think of the Odalisque, except here they're being sexualized while either sick in the process of dying or they're dead. One of them really looks like a corpse. I read that one interpretation of this painting is that it depicts a plague in Rome during a time when the emperor was trying to turn away from Christianity. So the plague is divine justice. and also a commentary on the Protestant Reformation turning away from the Catholic Church. So the dead women represent the barbarism of paganism meeting divine judgment. In a way, it's sort of like a proto-Odalisque because it's an othered body, which is supposed to be rejected by the viewer, but becomes a site of intense desire, even as a corpse. So in inhabiting the pose of the Odalisque, I wanted to connect the limp repose of that body and its passive sexuality with what you could think of as a more active imagination of sexuality, both through the birthing of children and through the image of Kali. The pose gets to the feeling of exhaustion, of being a mother in a visceral way, but I wanted to show how that exhaustion is part of something generative, something alive and powerful. Behind both the figures in the Kali Odalisque and Kali Lactans are images of neurons. This is a reference to the book The Nurture Revolution, which the series is named after. The book is written by a neuroscientist who became a doula and talks about the importance of nurture in infant brain development, which is intimately tied to future positive mental health outcomes. The author coined the term nurture bath to describe the mixture of chemicals and hormones that flood an infant's brain when they receive acts of nurture. Moments of connection like skin-to-skin contact, breastfeeding, baby wearing, sleeping next to a caregiver or while being held, and just generally being responded to when they are in distress. This is one way that these poses, the Odalisque and the Lactans, are active generative poses while simultaneously being poses of surrenders to the reality of the body over the needs of the self. So this is one of those thorny positions I'm trying to understand in this process of becoming a mother. I've been reflecting on how I was introduced to feminism. I remember taking what was essentially an introduction to feminism class in undergrad at the University of Virginia. On the first day of class, the professor asked everyone to raise their hand if they were a feminist. I, of course, raised my hand, then took it down, because I was one of only a handful of hands that went up in a room of over 100 people, mostly women. I honestly thought it must have been a trick question, or I had not heard the question correctly. But what I realized was that this was just how conservative UVA was at that time, that my peers honestly thought that they weren't feminists. Of course, at the end of the semester, the same question was asked, and close to everyone, or probably everyone, raised their hands. And I'm sure they were all super proud of themselves and the feminist awakening that they had gone through. But looking back, what I'm realizing was how white that class was, from the professor and the teaching assistants right down to the students. And while I'm sure, though I can't remember, I assume there was an effort to include women of color, at least in the readings that we were doing, the class was still very much grounded in the ideology of white feminism. And so in many ways, my understanding of feminism has been grounded in that too. And if we're being really, truly honest, we have to contend with the reality that the mission of white feminism is less interested in dismantling all systems of oppression and more interested in white women getting the privileges and power of white men. And this deeply colors how white feminism thinks about motherhood. I'm reminded of the radical second-wave feminist Shumalith Firestone. She saw pregnancy and childbirth as, in her words, barbaric, and believed that the only way women could be free would be by creating artificial reproduction, what she called a bottled baby, so that women could be free from childbirth like men. So she is imagining that all reproduction would happen in some kind of like closed tank somewhere where the baby would just gestate, be birthed from that, completely outside of women's bodies. I want to pause here and unpack the word barbaric. Barbaric means cruel, but also primitive or foreign. It comes from the word barbarian. Barbarian has roots in Latin, literally referring to the unintelligibility of speech. So the barbarian is literally somebody who cannot be understood. In the ancient world, it applied to everyone that was other. So all the people who are not Greek, all the people who are not Roman. I used it very intentionally earlier when I referred to paganism as barbarism. The idea that the other is inherently cruel, violent, inhuman runs deep in the Western imagination, and we see it play out over and over in our wars. We see it right now in Gaza as the civilized world, in quotation marks, of the West justifies the killing of children in self-defense. When Firestone referred to childbirth as barbaric, I believe she meant it in every sense of the word. Not only that it was painful, but it was somehow beneath her and women like her, that it belonged to the barbarians, to those outside of civilization, to blackness, indigeneity, to people of color. Ironically, by believing that childbirth was something to be liberated from, she was actually totally in alignment with the patriarchal system she was so vehemently against. Because the patriarchy associates the body with weakness, with the feminine, since the mind is masculine. The feminine is animalistic, like the body. Women's bodies in particular are seen as unruly, with their uncontrollable menstruation, the unpredictability of their fertility. Men in a variety of patriarchal cultures, not just in the West, have devoted a lot of time and energy to trying to figure out how to escape the body. Firestone equates freedom with the lives that white, privileged men lead. She accepts them as the measure that all other lives must be compared to, the end goal of liberation. But we know that their lives are predicated on the oppression of others. I wrote in an essay with Unsung Kim a few years ago called The Freedom to Oppress, where we unpacked this. But to boil it down, what we argued was that the concept of freedom in the dominant culture requires its opposite, which is slavery, in order to constitute itself. It is a type of power that can only exist as power over another, as having what others do not. In aligning her thinking to this ontology, she devalued pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing in the same way that patriarchy has devalued it by placing it outside of society, turning it into a type of forced, unpaid labor. But what if we said that the body has value, that things that are difficult and painful have value? The childbirth brings us to the precipice of life and death. It connects us to the intelligence of the universe. What if we chose to work to increase our interconnectedness if we recognized individualism as a myth of capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy? The residue of Firestone's feminism can be seen across our culture. I mentioned in the previous episode about a storyline on The Good Fight where a character takes a month off after having a baby, and this is framed as somehow empowering, as she isn't sacrificing, in quotation marks, her career to something as inconvenient as a baby. We see it in a lot of popular parenting advice that centers the need to manage or suppress the needs of infants in such a way as to maintain the independence of the upper middle class, often assumed white working mother. A great example is the book Crib Sheet, written by an economist with no medical training. She advocates for the extinction method of sleep training, which involves leaving a baby to cry alone in a dark room until it just gives up. It's worth interrogating these ideas as cultural, though they are often peddled by white male medical professionals. A Miami pediatrician named Walter W. Sackett Jr. wrote in 1962 about the importance of feeding babies on a schedule and not feeding them overnight at all. Quote, "If we teach our offspring to expect everything be provided on demand, we must admit the possibility that we are sowing the seeds of socialism," end quote. And he also went on to compare what he thought of as an overindulgent parents, which would just be parents that respond to their babies. He compared them to Hitler or Stalin. It becomes clear when we look critically at how this culture thinks about child rearing that nurture is deeply political and deeply challenging to systems of oppression. Going back to the book, The Nurture Revolution, in it, the author, Greer Krishenbaum, talks about 3 stages in human development with enhanced neuroplasticity. The first being during infancy, which has the most neuroplasticity, followed by another stage in adolescence, which has a lot, but not as much as in infancy. And then a final stage when you become a parent, where you again experience this period of neuroplasticity, which is an opportunity to change how your brain works, really, which is quite interesting. I remember reading a blog post many years ago that referenced this final stage, but in it, the author, who was a woman, framed this as basically the baby rewiring your brain to make you love it, a kind of manipulation. And I just see this metaphor of an infant as a parasite quite often in sort of pop feminist writing. And again, this residue of Firestone and the kind of thinking that she was engaging in, the idea that liberation comes by freeing ourselves from the commitments of parenthood. But what if we looked at that rewiring that I actually found kind of scary, when I sort of encountered it many, many years before I experienced it. What if we looked at it in a different way? I've been thinking about this time with my son as an opportunity to rewrite the pathways in my brain that were set when I was an infant and adolescent. Pathways that tell me that I am not good enough, that keep me trapped in cycles of fear and self-doubt. This time of neuroplasticity is an opportunity to not only bathe my baby's brain with oxytocin, but also my own. And so I think we should look at some of the cultural ideas that come with this time with a lot of skepticism. Ideas that we should bounce back right after giving birth, that you shouldn't spoil the baby by holding it too much, responding too often to its cries, that it is wrong to bed share or contact nap, that we should go back to work as fast as possible and send our child to daycare. These are all things that not only diminish our opportunities to nurture our children, they diminish the opportunities for our children to nurture us. In the Nurture Revolution artwork, I tried to capture the dissolution of self that happens in the 4th trimester. I don't want to universalize my experience. I think everyone experiences this time in different ways that are not only affected by access to support and resources, but also by cultural expectations. Many people talk about how they lost themselves when they became mothers. And this was actually an aspect of motherhood that I had a lot of fear around. For me, it wasn't that I lost who I was. I am still very much the same person. I would argue that maybe I kind of leveled up. For me, I went through what some cultures call an initiation, what in tarot you might call a tower moment. It was a time where every bit of my ego had to surrender to something outside of myself, where I truly lost power. But that was a type of power that was built around the yardstick of freedom and individualism that had been implanted in me by the dominant culture. Yes, I did not have control over when I got to sleep, eat, use the toilet. Yes, I felt that I was not so much myself, but simply a vessel for breast milk and a warm body to sleep on. But what I wanted to get at in the artwork was that there was a completely different type of power at play here, one pretty much completely unrecognized by Western culture. And that also, perhaps, there is power in letting go of the self. Over the past few months, I've been interested in a philosophical concept called posthumanism, in which we begin to look at the world as if humans were not the central characters. This opens up so many interesting avenues of inquiry But one idea that I think comes through in the Nurture Revolution artwork is challenging the idea of a fixed self, which is at the root of the logic of individualism, that we are walled off from the world around us and we're self-contained. Our bodies and minds are not simply a product of our genes and our environment. Through epigenetics, they are also a product of the environment and experiences of our ancestors. Having been pregnant and given birth, cells from my son have taken up residence all over my body, including my brain, and they will stay there until I die. Scientists speculate that this is a two-way street and that my cells, and maybe even my mother's cells, live on in the body of my son. As I mentioned in my essay, in terms of number of cells, the majority of our body is made up of our microbiome rather than the cells with our own genetic code. At the cellular level, our mitochondria were once viruses that our cells' ancestors took in and made part of themselves. In his book Entangled Life, Merlin Sheldrake coins the term symborg to describe these relationships, a term that can be applied to all life. After the cyborg, which is a being that is a fusion of a living organism and a piece of technology, a symborg is a symbiotic organism, a refutation of the idea of the individual in biological terms. Kali Odalisque and Kali Lactans attempt to point towards this experience of being a mother, the source of nourishment not only for the body, but for the mind, and how it is an enactment of the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life, and that this enactment is difficult, challenging, and all-encompassing, that it spans the microscopic to the cosmic. It is the work of healing the self, healing timelines, but also the work of transcending self, the boundaries between self and other. It is a radical work because it gets to the root of toxic individualism, of the trauma of living in empire. Another world is possible, and sometimes it feels very far away, but we can create it when we nurture our children, ourselves, each other. It is an act of revolution because it upends the power structures that the dominant culture depends on. It takes away its power to cause harm. This work demands sacrifice, surrender, entry into the unknown, the dark. It challenges core ideas around selfhood, individualism, ideas that are planted in all of us who grew up in empire, some of us from the time that we are babies. The indoctrination is relentless and the detox is difficult. The dominant culture turns against it instinctually, like nurture is a virus because the body itself is the sickness, and to be well is to threaten it. At the start of this podcast, I said I was struggling to balance taking care of myself with taking care of my son, but that's not really true, because our care is intimately connected. What I'm really struggling with is how to continue in this life I have built in this culture, one that provides nominal material security through my labor that, even in a nonprofit, only serves to prop up structures of violence, while treating my most essential labor as valueless, or worse, a hindrance on my productivity in upholding structures I abhor. I've realized that freedom isn't an absence of commitment. True freedom is choosing your commitments, and that is a freedom beyond the imagination of this culture.